Oscar Piastri takes home his second win of the season, bringing him within 3 points of the lead in the Drivers' Championship. We always looked at Oscar as a contender for the Drivers' Championship, but is it time to start looking at him as the favorite? Another podium finish for George Russell, a better than expected weekend for Ferrari, Alpine, and Haas, and a back-to-reality weekend for Red Bull. But the real headline is the drama after the race, with Max Verstappen's manager giving Helmut Marko a piece of his mind. What we know about the tense confrontation at this point, and why it could be bad news for Red Bull's future with Max. All coming up next on the Chicanery Podcast. Well, it might not have been Australia, but at least it wasn't Japan, and at least we got some excitement out of the Bahrain Grand Prix. Oscar Piastri finishes P1, George Russell P2, and Lando Norris finishes P3. A great weekend for McLaren in the grand scheme of things, but it should have been better, and it should have been a 1-2 instead of a 1-3. It was a perfect weekend from Oscar Piastri. He earned his second career pole on Saturday and is now 2 for 2 on converting those poles into race wins. It was Oscar's race to lose from start to finish, though. Probably the closest it got for him was the first corner of the first lap where George Russell got alongside of him on the outside. It nearly crashed into him turning into that corner. But Oscar pulled away after that and never really looked back. Even with the safety car closing things up, you never really felt like he was at risk of losing the race. It was another race where Oscar built up such a lead and had complete control of the race that he was almost forgotten. I mean, we literally had Oscar crossing the finish line, taking the checkered flag, and the broadcast doesn't even have him on the main screen. Instead, we have George and Lando 15 seconds behind, fighting for second and third, and the broadcast is like, oh yeah, by the way, Oscar just won. Congrats to him. But an eventful, low-stress, but dominant win by the Australian driver. A much different story, though, for his teammate Lando Norris. Just a weekend riddled with mistakes. It all started in qualifying, and you could tell right away that McLaren had the fastest car, and it was their pole to lose. Lando has the edge over Oscar in Q1. It flips in Oscar's favor for Q2, still advantage Oscar for the first Q3 runs, and then it all unraveled for Lando in the final run of Q3. He got loose coming out of turn 1. That cost him about 1/10 of a second, but it just snowballed from there for the rest of the lap. But that was enough to cost him not only pole, but drop him all the way down to 6th for the start of the race. And at that point, you thought, all right, a race win is probably out of the picture for Lando, unless he gets an incredible start or something crazy happens with safety cars or retirements or something unexpected. And we did get that incredible start from Lando. He moved up 3 positions on the start, navigated around slower traffic flawlessly, and made the overtake stick on the outside of Leclerc going into the first few turns. But then we get the notification that he's under investigation for being out of order on the start, and we end up realizing that he's going to get a penalty for starting outside of his grid box. Just some amazing footage of Max on the start line, noticing this right away and getting on the radio to tell on Lando. But a mistake from Lando that shouldn't happen. And honestly, it looked like driver error from his onboard camera. He pulled up to the grid box, put the car to neutral and then first gear, but then it went back into neutral, and that's when he rolled forward a little bit too far. But a clear-cut decision for the stewards, and Lando gets a 5-second penalty, which he serves during his first pit stop. But because of the penalty, McLaren probably brings Lando into the pits a little earlier than they wanted to, so they could serve that penalty and possibly still get an undercut on George Russell in second. Mercedes is, of course, watching for this, brings George in just in time, so the undercut doesn't work. And now Lando has a tire offset working against him with the cars around him, which really hurt him at the end of that second stint. Fortunately for Lando, though, we get a safety car on lap 32, which evens everything out with the tires. And at this point, Lando's in fourth between the two Ferraris in third and fifth. And on the first lap of the restart, Lando does lose position to Lewis in fifth, but gets back around him on the outside of turn 4, but makes the move off track. So the team radios in and says, hey, Lando, you got to give the position back. Let's not get another penalty. And Lando does give the position back and does get ahead of Lewis on the next lap, but just lost some crucial time in these moments that really would have worked in his favor at the end of the race. Now, I don't have this as necessarily a driving error like the others, but it came out at the end of the race with Lando trying to get ahead of Leclerc and Russell. Wheel-to-wheel racing is not a strength of his compared to the other top drivers. Lando is really fast around track, and that's usually enough to get him in front, or he has the speed with DRS to just breeze by other cars on the straight. But in these moments where he's really battling with another driver, the other driver tends to come out on top more often than not. And a lot of times these moments are like a game of chicken, and whoever backs out last holds that position, and it's usually Lando backing out first in those battles. But if you look at all of these mistakes over the weekend, if just one of them goes the other way, I think Lando finishes P2 pretty easily. And if the qualifying mistake never happens and he gets pole, we might even see Lando with a race win coming out of this weekend. Even with a podium result, though, a tough weekend for Lando Norris. The positive side is it could have been much worse. And there was some damage control by him, and he's still coming out of this weekend leading the Drivers' Championship. But after 4 races, we have Lando in first with 77 points, Oscar in second with 74, and Max in third with 69. And this race result begs the question whether we should start looking at Oscar Piastri as the favorite to win the Drivers' Championship. There's no doubt that we're seeing a much more improved version of Oscar Piastri this year than we saw in the first 2 seasons. His biggest struggle the last 2 years came with tire management. It was almost a certainty that you could bank on Oscar starting a race or coming out of a pit stop and just being too aggressive and burning through his tires early and then losing all of his pace towards the end of a stint as a result. This seems to almost be entirely gone now. This was the type of race where you would have seen those issues with him, and we didn't. You expected to see some improvement in this area from Oscar coming into the season, just with his development and maturity as a driver, but to almost completely erase this issue was pretty unexpected. But not only has Oscar fixed this weakness, but if any McLaren driver seems to struggle with tire wear this season, it's been Lando. And right now we're looking at Oscar still in second behind Lando in the driver's standings, but it could easily be a much different story. What if that incident never happened in Australia for Oscar, and he finishes that race in second? Say we even still give Lando the win and Max third. That would put Oscar in first in the championship with 90 points, Lando in second with 77, and Max in third with 66. It shows you how big of a moment that was for the Drivers' Championship, but also how quickly Oscar has recovered from that error in Australia. Another stat that shows the momentum that Oscar's been building, laps led for this season. Oscar's in first with 107. Lando's in second with 56. Things feel like they flip between these two. The weaknesses that Oscar has had don't seem so weak anymore, and the advantages that Lando has had over him don't feel like those strong advantages anymore. George Russell comes away with a P2 finish and another podium in what was really another strong race for him. It all started in qualifying with just an incredible lap in Q3 that originally put him on the front row, but a penalty after qualifying bumped him back a spot to third. But even with that, George nailed the start, got ahead of Leclerc on the run down to turn 1, and almost got ahead of Oscar with a pretty aggressive move, but was at least able to hold on to second. What was really surprising, though, was George's ability to hold off Lando behind him throughout the race at multiple stages. George was probably helped a little bit by Lando being in the dirty air behind him, and also Lando coming into the pits earlier than expected to serve that time penalty, which gave George a tire advantage. But considering how fast Oscar was in first, you expected Lando to get around George at some point, and it never happened. And to make things more impressive, George was dealing with a laundry list of problems with his car throughout the race. He had a brake-by-wire failure during the last 10 laps, so the brake pedal was essentially just going all the way down to the floor, similar to the problem we saw Lando have in China. George's car's transponder stopped working, which sent the timing screens into chaos, but also made it really tricky for George and the other cars around him to know if they were in DRS range. But most notably was George's DRS malfunctioning and opening when he was out of DRS range. I'm a little surprised George and Mercedes avoided a penalty after the race for this DRS issue. I guess the FIA's justification was that George only gained 0.02 of a second when it opened and backed off and gave up almost 0.3 of a second in the next corner, so no harm, no foul as far as the FIA is concerned. But it seems like one of those clear-cut things that normally would have gotten a penalty. Now, it wasn't shown or talked about on the broadcast either, but Leclerc also had a moment where his DRS inadvertently opened, so maybe there were some other factors involved with the track that allowed the FIA to show George some mercy. But considering all of these issues that he was dealing with, on top of having a faster McLaren on his heels, just a really impressive weekend from George Russell. And he has now finished in the top 5 in every race this season, including the sprint race in China. And he's the only driver who can say that. A better than expected weekend for Ferrari, but still some concerns coming out of the race. So both cars start on mediums, and we're the only ones not on soft tires at the start, other than Fernando Alonso and Liam Lawson. It seemed like a risky strategy, and the one that made you think, oh boy, here goes Ferrari again. But it actually seemed to work out for Lewis and didn't really hurt Leclerc that much either. And both were in the top 5 when the safety car came out. But I think the safety car really threw things off for them, and they were kind of just caught in between strategies in that moment. So we have the safety car come out on lap 32, so almost everyone comes in for their last stop. Without this safety car, the Ferrari strategy looked like it would have been 2 stints on the medium and then finishing the race on the softs. But at this point, with 25 laps to go, it just looked too risky to go onto the soft tires. Of course, we know from George Russell that they could have made the softs work and they might have actually been the faster tire for the end of the race. But the timing of the safety car and the decision they had to make in this moment really threw a lot off for Ferrari. They were showing a really strong pace on that second medium stint. But the safety car neutralizes that and caught them out on a tire that wasn't better than the cars ahead of them at the end of the race. Without that safety car happening, though, we might have had a stronger result for Ferrari and Charles. Might have even gotten up to third and gotten ahead of Lando. And probably a better situation, a better race result for Lewis Hamilton too. Now, Ferrari did bring the floor upgrades to this weekend. And Leclerc did warn us that this wasn't the best track for these upgrades. And we should really see the strength of these upgrades in Jeddah next weekend. Now, we'll see what the other upgrades are coming in the near future for this car. But I am a little bit concerned about this new floor and the results it produced this weekend. Ferrari was putting a lot of stock into this new floor. And there were a lot of reports that once they brought this new floor, they would be back up to the top of the pecking order. Well, they did, and they were still 19 and 27 seconds off the lead. And that was after a safety car closed up the field halfway through the race. Now, again, there was somewhat of a tire disadvantage at the end for these two drivers. Oscar was on the mediums, they were on the hards, but that almost amounts to about a second faster a lap. And to still have that kind of gap between themselves and the leader of the race is a little concerning. Now, it's at least a step in the right direction and an improvement from what we've seen earlier in the season, but you expected a bigger step with these Ferrari upgrades. We have drama at Red Bull. Not a great race for the team. Max struggles really the entirety of the race with balance and tire degradation issues. They air his radio messages a few times throughout the race, and he was not happy and clearly frustrated with the car. But not only that, but we also saw some pit stop issues that we hardly ever see with this team. Slow stops all around for both drivers, partly because of mistakes the pit crew made just struggling to get the tires off, but also a weird situation where the pit light that tells the drivers when it's okay to leave the pit box was malfunctioning and not turning green. So both Max and Yuki had instances where they were stopped for a few extra seconds for no reason. But Max ends up finishing P6 thanks to a last lap pass on Pierre Gasly. Yuki ends up finishing P9, which is actually a good result just for his own prospects with the team, considering Max only finished 11 seconds ahead of him. Also, just a side note, the first time since Vegas of last year that Red Bull has had a double points finish, which really tells you just how far this team has fallen off. But Max finishing 34 seconds off the lead is a staggering result and really puts things back into perspective for this team after the high last weekend in Japan. And it's apparently not being perceived too well by Max and his management. After the race, Ted Kravitz with Sky Sports reported that Max's manager, Raymond Vermeulen, confronted Helmut Marko in the Red Bull garage and gave him, quote, a piece of his mind. Helmut apparently just stood there and took it, per the report, and then Vermeulen stormed off the garage, taking his paddock pass off. Now, I'm sure tensions from the race were still running high in this moment, and that probably exaggerated things a little bit. But the reaction from Red Bull to this is what's concerning me the most. The team held an emergency meeting with Christian Horner, Helmut Marko, Pierre Wash, and Paul Monaghan. Helmut Marko was also asked by Sky Germany about the level of fear he has of Max leaving Red Bull because of the issues with the car, and Helmut said it's a huge fear. Now, it's also been confirmed in the weeks prior that an exit clause does exist in Max's contract if he falls out of the top 3 in the Drivers' Championship. And where is he now? 3rd, with George Russell only 6 points behind. There's a lot starting to add up that makes you think a Red Bull Max Verstappen split could be likely in the future. I think if it does happen, it doesn't happen before next season. I think Max wants to see how the new regulations shake out next year and where everyone stands, and it probably would be smart of him to do that. Now, of course, the most popular theory is if Max leaves, he would probably go to Mercedes, taking George Russell's seat. I don't think it's Mercedes, though. Toto Wolff has been very supportive of George Russell lately and has recently said he's happy with their driver lineup. We'll see if there's any truth to it, but it looks like George might be on the verge of signing a new deal that keeps him with the team through 2028. So if Max does leave, the only team that makes sense is Aston Martin, which seems shocking that Max would leave a struggling Red Bull to go to a team that struggled even more. But that's why I think the move doesn't happen going into next year. Aston Martin will have to show promise that they can be competitive in the new regulations. But there are a lot of familiar faces in the Aston Martin garage and in their facilities that they took from Red Bull, most notably being Adrian Newey, of course. But despite their struggles, I think Max has faith in the team and trust in some of the key members in that team. Now, another aspect of this is Max's desire to race in another racing series outside of Formula One. He's made no secret that he wants to leave F1 earlier than most so he can compete in races like the 24 Hours of Le Mans and other racing series. Now, Max's current deal runs through 2028, and of course, if he switched teams, this contract would become void. But it might give us some indication of a timeline with how Max sees the rest of his career unfolding. It would not be surprising at all if Aston Martin threw an offer at Max that's so high that he almost can't say no, which they certainly have the funds to do. And it's under the terms of, all right, race for us in F1 for a few years. And then if you want to, we'll let you go race in the World Endurance Championship for our teams or wherever else you want to go. And Aston Martin has that advantage over Red Bull. They have teams in endurance racing. Red Bull doesn't. If it's not Aston Martin, though, is there anywhere else that makes sense? McLaren has Lando and Oscar signed for years to come. Mercedes seem to be happy with George and Kimi. Maybe a seat at Ferrari opens when Lewis retires. We'll have to wait and see how this all plays out, but it doesn't look good at all for Red Bull. They've been heading in the wrong direction for almost a year now, and the pressure to turn this around keeps building. But there isn't a lot that makes you think that turnaround is coming anytime soon. Going to a few other teams, really good races for some of the midfield teams. Let's start with Alpine, who had Pierre Gasly finish P7. Jack Doohan finished P14, but still a strong race for him, spending a lot of the race in the top 10. Pierre, though, was strong all weekend long. Second fastest time in FP1, sixth fastest in FP3, qualifies fifth, which turns into a fourth with the Mercedes penalties. Now, Doohan got really unfortunate in the race with the timing of the safety car. Both Alpine drivers came into the pits 3 laps before the safety car in lap 29, but Gasly came out ahead of some traffic, and Doohan came out behind, which really hurt his race. So the safety car comes 3 laps later. Everyone around Doohan gets a cheap pit stop, and he's lost enough time behind them where it really hurts him. The tire choice from this pit stop before the safety car was the real killer for Jack Doohan, though. He goes onto the hard tires on lap 29, which was the right choice at that moment of the race, with 28 laps left. But when the race restarts, everyone behind Doohan, other than Carlos Sainz, is on the medium or soft tire. Just not a whole lot he can do in that situation. And that's why he fell back to 13th at the time, but a track limit penalty pushed that to a P14 finish. But if that safety car never happened, I think there's a good chance we would have seen Doohan finish in the points. It looks like this was the weekend Doohan needed to save his seat at least. We heard he originally had 6 races to prove himself, but now it's being reported that he'll at least have until the middle of the season to prove to the team that he should stay in that seat for the rest of the season and beyond. But overall, a good weekend for Alpine, and one they have to be happy with. This was just a track that brought the most out of their car, and they were really good in the high-speed corners. Alpine just has a way of doing this, where they struggle, and then all of a sudden, they show up to a race weekend and are randomly competitive. But considering how things went for this team last year, they're moving in the right direction. And like McLaren, Alpine is another example of how the FIA regulations over wind tunnel time are working by giving more time to the lower teams to close up the field. Going to Haas, Esteban Ocon finishes P8, Ollie Bearman finishes P10 for the team's second double points finish of the year. Just a really impressive result for both of these drivers, especially considering Ocon started the race 14th and Bearman started dead last. The start was crucial for both drivers, but especially Bearman gaining 5 positions on that first lap. But strategy is really what produced these results for these two drivers. Ocon pits early on lap 8, very early actually compared to the rest of the field. Goes on to mediums, but that allowed him to undercut Antonelli, Max, Yuki, Sainz, and Doohan. Now, Ocon came in for a second stop on lap 28 and goes onto the hard tires, but unlike Jack Doohan, this one actually worked out for him with the safety car 4 laps later. He comes out of the pits after the second stop in 14th, but makes up a few positions over the next few laps with the other cars coming in for their second stop. The safety car comes out while he's in 12th, but when the race restarts, he's all the way up to 7th because of those cars ahead of him coming in for their second stops under the safety car. Bearman was one of those cars that came into the pits that Ocon jumped, but Ollie went onto the soft tires for his last stint, which really put him in the position to get ahead of Carlos Sainz and Jack Doohan and get into the points. Cool moment after the race between Ollie and his dad, where his dad jumped on the radio to congratulate him. It's this type of stuff that makes him so likable, in my opinion. You know, he's already proven that he's a very talented driver and definitely has a place in F1 for years to come. But he's not cocky or entitled about anything. Whether it's a good race or a bad race, he's just humble and positive, and honestly, it's a breath of fresh air compared to what we see from other drivers in this position sometimes. But this weekend was another breath of fresh air for Haas, who now find themselves 5th in the constructors' standings. All right, finishing up with the winners and losers of the weekend. Starting with the winners, obvious choice here, Oscar Piastri. Again, just another perfect weekend by him, and a race win that puts him in a very good position for the Drivers' Championship. What makes things more impressive, though, is it only took Oscar 3 races to dig himself out of that hole from the Australian Grand Prix. But exactly the type of weekend he needed, and one that puts him in a very strong position for the championship race. Another winner, George Russell. Mr. Consistency strikes again. George has, without a doubt, been the 3rd best driver on the grid this season. There's still some more to go to catch up to the McLarens, but he's shown multiple times that he can hold them off if he's out in front. And I don't think it will be long before we see George on the top step of a podium winning a race this season. Going to Ferrari, also have them as a winner. Not the best weekend, but overall a solid weekend for them, considering where they have been the last few races. There's a lot of hope they'll make another step next weekend in Jeddah, just at a track where these upgrades should perform better. And they probably expected more of a jump out of the new floor this weekend, but it at least showed some improvement, and they at least have a base to work off of for the rest of the year. Alpine, another winner. They finally score points, their first points of the season thanks to Pierre Gasly. An unexpected result for this team, though. They showed really strong pace, and although it will fluctuate from track to track, they've shown they can be competitive at the right track. Last winter, I have Haas, without a doubt the strongest midfield team at this stage of the season. Ayo Komatsu deserves a lot of credit for this early success, but so does their driver lineup. Ollie Beerman has now scored points at every race other than Australia, and he and Esteban Ocon are turning out to be a very strong pairing. We have a long way to go, but you have to like where this team is headed based on these early races. Going to the losers of the weekend, Lando Norris. Just too many mistakes, and unfortunately, it isn't the first time we've seen Lando let a weekend snowball like this. Now, the good news for him is he's still in the lead for the Drivers' Championship, and he still has plenty of time to turn this around. But he has to start having perfect weekends, like his teammate had this weekend, if he really wants to remain a title contender. I have Red Bull as a loser too. Not so much for Max, not so much for Yuki even, but just for this team's future. Max Verstappen's future with this team seems very murky, which seemed impossible a year or two ago. I do think Red Bull has more time than people expect to turn this around, but if they don't, it might be a certainty that we see Max leave for another team in the future. Kimi Antonelli I have as the loser of the weekend. We didn't talk much about him, but not the best race. Other than Carlos Sainz, Kimi ended up being the only driver to do more than 2 pit stops, and that essentially ruined his race. He was undercut on the first pit stops and then tried to undercut others with the second pit stops to make up for it, which ended up being fatal to his race. He went on soft tires during the second stop on lap 28, but pushed too hard in those 4 laps before the safety car, which made the team bring him in again for a third stop, which really ended his race from there. Probably a little bit on the team too. Maybe some bad luck thrown in there, but not a good weekend from Kimi Antonelli. I've got 4 teams to finish up the list that I've basically split into 2 categories. I have Racing Bulls and Williams in the first. Poor performances by both drivers on both teams, but the disappointment is thanks to the expectations they built up to this point in the season. A P12 for Albon and a retirement for Carlos Sainz, a P13 for Isaac Hadjar, and a P16 for Liam Lawson. You expected more out of both of these teams, and they just didn't deliver this weekend. Another weekend where Alex Albon beat Sainz on track, and more crucial for Racing Bulls, another weekend that Isaac Hadjar finished ahead of Liam Lawson. My second category, I have Aston Martin and Sauber. No failure to meet expectations for these 2 teams. They're just bad. The downfall of Aston Martin from 2023 continues. P3 and P6 finishes at this track in 2023. P9 and P10 last year, and now P16 and P18 this year. It is just constantly trending in the wrong direction for this team. At least they have Adrian Newey working on next year's car, but it seems like they might just be driving around for fun this year. For Sauber, not only does Bortoleto finish P18, but Nico Hulkenberg is disqualified after the race for excessive plank wear. Not the worst thing, because he crossed the finish line P14, so there weren't any points at stake, but there's just not a lot that gives you hope for this team. All right, that's a wrap on today's episode recapping the Bahrain Grand Prix. We will, of course, be back next weekend for the final leg of this triple header in Saudi Arabia. I will, of course, be back with 2 more episodes, one later in the week, previewing the race weekend and the Grand Prix, and, of course, one after the race on Sunday, recapping everything that we saw. Hopefully, we're in for more excitement. Hopefully, we don't get any more repeats of Japan. But either way, I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about, especially as everything unfolds with this whole Red Bull situation with Max. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Until next time.